When we moved into our current home nearly 12 years ago or so, we had a fire extinguisher in our garage. And I really didn't take note of it or think of it too seriously um, until couple of years ago. There was a house a block away from our home that caught on fire. We don't know how the fire started, and one half of the house was completely burnt away. And you could drive it and see. And I remember seeing the smoke one evening from that side, and then found out that the house was on fire. And this, I got suddenly reminded, well, since fire seems to be a threat, let's check the fire extinguisher that we have in our house. It had a nice label, it had a serial number and inspections. So I came home, opened our garage, took the fire extinguisher, removed the pin and pressed, and what came out was only air. And I was shocked. And I was wondering, if there was a fire in our house, this fire extinguisher would be of absolutely no use today. And that's when immediately we went on Amazon and bought a fire extinguisher that we knew actually worked. That reminds me, I need to check that. It's been a couple of years since we did that too. Sometimes our faith is something when it is not tested. We all believe in something. We have a faith system. Every single person. It doesn't matter what religious orientation or philosophy you have. We have a faith that we all have, but you never know how significant your faith is or how helpful your faith is unless there is a crisis or a fire hazard in our life. Our faith normally doesn't get tested in the daily course of life. We live, we go to work, we come home. Especially here in Silicon Valley, everybody seems to lead a normal life. But our faith will get tested when something goes on fire. It is at that moment you will be able to see if what you have held as your core faith or belief or philosophical ideas or worldview is actually able to help you survive the storm, survive the fire, and get through it. I don't mean to scare you, but I want to ask you a realistic question. God forbid if any of these things were to happen to us. But let's see if in 10 minutes, if your husband dies, your wife dies, your child dies, is your faith strong enough to sustain you, to help you go through that? We have people in our church who have had that. We have experienced that in our own family. Several of you have experienced that in your own families too. So is your faith able to help you to have your bearings, to experience hope, to sustain and go through as you walk through the valley of darkness? That's the theme we are going to look at today. I've titled my sermon today as Faith Unleashed. This is written by James. We are almost towards the end of our journey of walk through the Bible, where we started with the covenant community, the people of God in the Old Testament, and now James, the author, is none other than the brother of Jesus himself. But James is someone who did not believe a word of what Jesus said when he was alive. You can be the brother of Jesus and still not believe what Jesus said. You can be in the church all your life, still not believe what the gospel is. And what it took for James to change is in 1 Corinthians 15, towards the end, we read that Jesus appeared to him after he was resurrected and alive, is when James had a shift in his faith. And he became so passionate about his faith that he began to start sharing. They say the book of James is probably the very first book written in the New Testament in the years between 40 to 44 AD. And since James knew Jesus, the physical side of him as his brother, I think his faith got rooted more strongly when he saw that his brother, his physical brother, was not just a physical person. You don't have someone who's your brother who dies and then comes back alive. He realized this was God himself. And his worldview shifted. He was an agnostic, probably. Brother of Jesus can be an agnostic too. And now his faith was solidified. And so he is writing to the same covenant people. At this time, the church was just beginning to grow. We read about that in Acts chapter 2. It was the people of Israel, the same covenant people, are now coming to see Jesus in Acts 2 when Peter preaches, and so many of those from the Jewish faith, they accept this good news of the gospel and they become Christians. But what happens when you become a Christian or when you change your faith system, it always comes with opposition, isn't it? Many of us may not know that because you probably were grown up or you're raised in a Christian family. But we have friends in our church who were not raised in a Christian family. You know what happens when they take Jesus seriously? You lose your entire family. You get ostracized. They feel you betrayed them, that you left the family's faith or tradition. And therefore, it is sometimes that becomes a stumbling block for some people to take that step. But the first century Christians were willing to take that step. Not only does your family disown you, you don't get a job. People will not hire you because it's a communal society. And so what happens to you then is you don't have a job. You end up experiencing poverty. You don't get to be able to feed yourself, your family, and your children. And add to that, there is a famine that happened around that time, kind of like a big recession. So already you don't have a job. Already you've lost your family. You've lost provisions of food. And then there is a famine. It's one of the most devastating times. And you just became a new Christian. And you thought now God is going to bless you and take care of you. And you're hit with all of these things. And that burdens James. So he writes to encourage these new young Christians who have changed from a completely different faith system, from a Jewish system of faith to accepting Jesus Christ. And all that James knew, he was so well versed in the Bible, especially the Old Testament. And if you read the book of James, it almost looks like you're reading Proverbs. That's the style that James writes. His writings are very practical for our day-to-day living. He writes about people how when they go through suffering, he wants to encourage them and give them a perspective of what suffering can do to you. He writes to them about wisdom. Literally, that's what a lot of Proverbs talks about. He says, well, I want you to understand how you can experience or understand truth. Or basically, he teaches them how to think rightly about thinking. That's usually the problem when people, one of the stumbling blocks why they cannot understand Christianity or the gospel is because you don't know how to think rightly about thinking. They call it epistemology. It's a whole study by itself. So he writes to them, don't let your circumstances cloud how you think about who you are and who God is. And then he talks to them very practical things. How should their ethical life be like? How should you talk? How should your tongue? Your tongue is so powerful. Your words are powerful. And how to speak in a way that builds people. And here in this chapter, he touches on a very, very central theme. He talks about your faith. And because of this, James was called James the Just, because he was so concerned about practical Christian living. And he was writing about how in the New Testament, the same covenant people, how God expects you and I to live. So there are three types of people. There are three types of faith that people can have. And that's what James is writing about. So I've titled those 3 points, the 3 types of faith, as dead faith, demonic faith, and dynamic faith. And he's wanting them to introspect and ask them to think, what is their type of faith? And I paraphrased it in an easier way. This may not be absolutely accurate, but this is what each of those faith can be summarized as. A dead faith, James says, is a faith without works, or all talk, no walk. A demonic faith is a faith which has no talk and no walk. And a dynamic faith is a faith which has no talk and all walk. I'll try to unpack that for us. A dead faith is a faith which is all talk and no walk. We use the phrase, hey, are you walking the talk? Isn't it? Very commonly. Well, James is talking about people who think or claim they know truth. They have figured it out. This refers to people, especially in Silicon Valley, who rub shoulders with so many different people. Many of them are irreligious. They're not like super religious about any religion, whether it's Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or Confucianism, their Asian American friends. They don't think it's easy. They'll give you a standard answer. I believe all roads lead to the same God. There is just one God. There's one truth. There's something absolute. Sounds phenomenal and brilliant. And that's the first group of people, he says. They not only can live outside the church, there can also be people inside the church who can give you all the right answers when you ask them the question, but then their life really doesn't show up. So he gives a very pragmatic test for them. We read about that in verse 14 onwards. He says, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. What he's talking about is specifically those within this covenant community. He says, a faith that is not moved by seeing your brothers and sisters who are, it's not talking about people who are, it says poorly clothed. That's a very poor translation. The Greek word is gymnos, from which comes gymnastics. So the gymnasts, when they were doing gymnastics, because of how their body had to be free, wore very, very minimal clothing, almost naked. The word used for naked was gymnos. So he's saying it's not like people have only 2 sets of dresses instead of having 10. He said they are people who have nothing. They're in abject poverty. And same, he's not talking about people lacking in daily food, like they have some meal but just nothing. He says they are starving. And this is not a one-time event. This is their lifestyle. These are brothers and sisters. These are people who are actually even known to them, who are living like that, and it doesn't move you. Then he says, well, I don't think your faith is real. I don't think it is going to help. Especially they knew from the Old Testament how they need to take care of people who don't have anything to do. You know, Martin Luther is someone who came up in the Reformation, and he brought faith right back into the center. And we believe that, we go to God. Our salvation is by grace through faith alone. And one of his followers, Melanchthon, came who after him. He says, he made a brilliant statement after that. He says, faith alone saves, but not a faith that stands alone. We are saved by faith alone, but not by a faith that stands alone without showing any good works. Because if you have really experienced God's generous gift and grace and love, you will be moved when you see someone who does not have much. So, a big test for people's faith is this. When so many people, especially again in our context of Silicon Valley, you've heard me say this several times, we have the most richest people on earth. The top 1% live in one zip code. But why is Silicon Valley the least philanthropic place on earth? All these people who talk about, I'm a good guy, we all just believe in the same thing, there's just one truth, one God. Wonderful. Why are they not giving for any of these major causes? I met with a college friend yesterday. He's a very influential person in the Sacramento area in politics, and he's not even a Christian. And he was talking about how, especially the Indian American community, referring to that, is one of the least philanthropic communities, despite being the richest ethnic minority in the United States. He said, as a community, our people are willing to pay $15 million to build a center of worship just in Pleasanton that happened recently. He was citing that. But says when there is a need, people do not want to step up, do not want to give their time, their money, and efforts. So James is questioning that. It's not just happening in other faith communities, he's questioning within the Christian community. That was not the model in the first church, the early church in Acts chapter 2 towards the end. I think Chiru preached a sermon on that once wonderfully. How when people came to know Christ, they sold all their possessions, they shared everything they had. And when there was famine and people left, Christians were the ones who stayed back, especially in Rome. After Nero was literally going and killing Christians and they persecuted and they fled. So when they came back, these Christians were there to receive them and care for them. So if you're someone who has tasted the love of Christ, you always run towards the fire like firefighters would do to rescue people, not run away from that. But we saw signs of that. We've seen signs of that in the old covenant people. As God was bringing the Israelites out, we saw how they started getting selfish. There was one family. What happened in Ai? They went and they fought a war. They got some goods. They kept it for themselves. They hid it. They didn't want to share. History repeats. Fast forward. Come to the book of Acts. There's Ananias and Sapphira. When they're asked to come and everybody's asked to share, they lie. And we see how God takes that seriously. In their cases, it's an extreme example. He was telling to demonstrate these people are not my people. They literally died instantaneously or were put to death. So, if your faith is all talk and no walk, that faith is not a real faith. And that faith is not only something that is not saving other people when they have a crisis, that faith cannot save you as well when you meet God face to face one day. And we may not be seeing amidst us, perhaps, people who are going through severe economic crisis, but there's always needs around us. And this faith will motivate us to be there for people when they go through pain, when they go through suffering. This faith will motivate us. If you ask, why is it that people don't do it? Especially those who have the more are the ones who give the least, is because there is a reason. Their faith is misplaced. Their faith is not placed in what is objectively true, who is God, who is gracious and loving, and gives everything he has, especially his own son. Their faith is on something else. There is always an object of faith, and that object for them was security and money. Even though you have hundreds or thousands of RSUs and stock options, people hold on to it and think, when I have enough, then I'll think of helping somebody else. It need not necessarily be about money. It can even be serving the community. Or like you come to church and you're just sitting and warming the pews. You're a consumer Christian. You don't even lift a pinky to help anything in the church. You just feel entitled, everybody should serve me. Well, that's a dead faith too. If that's who you are, you need to ask yourself, you need to tell yourself, this faith is a dead faith. It's not helping anybody. Even in small ways, it's not even about giving money. It's about chipping in to do something in a community where everybody come together. You have a dead faith, and it's not. If your faith is dead, it's not able to help others. Trust me, it will not help you when you face death or similar challenges in your own life, because it will show you it's a very hollow faith. It's a faith that's all talk and no walk. A few years ago, when my brother-in-law passed away, we came to know about this wonderful organization called Teammate that does tremendous work in helping families that have lost loved ones in a country outside to help transport them back to India. And we were so moved by it. I started volunteering with them, and I got to know the founder of that organization, and I've been part of the board and been helping them like that in several cases. Some of you know about this. And he's someone who doesn't believe in God. He's an atheist, and he's but he knows that I'm a pastor, and we talk, and he shares this with me. He says, I see this all the time, and especially in some other situations where people die, and we have to ask if they are from a different faith. We need to ask their religious leaders to come and do the rites. They charge $1,500 to $600 to come and do that religious ceremony. He says, this is why I don't believe in God. How can you be a religious person and make money over a dead body? Even someone who does not know God can smell and see a dead faith like that. So that's the extreme. You can have someone who is super religious, whose job it is to help, and doesn't, to someone who can do all the religious things, but as long as it doesn't create any discomfort, I'll just show up on time to church and I leave because I have my life to take care of. And I have to do this, and this, because that's going to give me my safety. Let me tell you, my friends, that's a dead faith. And when death strikes you, that faith will be of no use to you as well. Secondly, he talks of a second category of people. It gets deadly from one step to the other. I've titled this demonic faith. I'm not making this up. James is saying that. He says, verse 18, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. So the first is someone who says, it's, what was that? All talk and no walk. This one, you can say, all walk and no talk. I don't know. Maybe that's not a good line. No talk, no walk. Because what they're talking is not true. That's what James is saying. And therefore, they don't work. He says, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. And here's the deadly part. You believe that God is one. That just summarizes almost everybody in the Bay Area, whether they call it God or truth, right? You have to, if you're involved in scientific enterprise, and you can't say something is right or wrong unless there is absolute truth, or even for any of your statements to be true. If you don't believe in absolute truth, then anything you say is not true as well. So he says, you believe that God is one, you do well. And here's the kicker. Even the demons believe and shudder. So he says, this is a demonic faith. He says, even the demons have faith. Even the demons have faith. Why is that? Why is that? And he asks the question, do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? This is a group of people who have knowledge without any transformation. They can quote you Bible or Gita or Quran or Bertrand Russell or all those philosophers. But he says, the demons, they are pretty orthodox in their faith. Demons believe in monotheism because they actually were in the presence of God. You remember Lucifer, the first fall? He was an angel who fell from God's presence. None of us, no saint has ever had that experience. So he knows better theology than the best theologians the world has ever produced. Demons know scripture. What do they quote to Jesus when he is tempted in the wilderness? Does not your word say that your angels will take care of you if you jump down? They do memory verses every week, I guess. You should read Screw Tape Letters. C.S. Lewis has this fictional writing, right, about wormwood and screw tape, two demons trying to mess around with someone. So you can even know scripture a lot. They know judgment. They know God's going to judge. They're pretty serious about it. They know he's holy. We read in the book of Job how they reverentially ask God's permission before they can touch Job's life. They even know how to talk rightly to God. You can even, I don't know if you can say demonic prayer even, maybe, that conversation. It's perfectly theologically accurate. They know God is sovereign. That's why they're asking him his permission. They have perfect doctrine, accurate theology, but none of it produces love, obedience, or repentance. Puritan Jonathan Edwards, I read in a commentary, he preached on this particular verse. And Jonathan Edwards has some very fancy sermon titles. You know what his title for this sermon was? My title is just 2 words, Faith Unleashed. Easy, right, for you guys? Listen to his title. True Grace Distinguished from the Experience of Devils. How about that? Because he goes on, and his sermons are scary. You just listen to his sermons. They are so strong. They are so scary. He says, hey, demons have sound doctrine. They've been in the throne of God. And not just that. They not only believe. What does it say here? It says, even the demons believe and shudder. Whoa. They even have an emotional response to their faith. They shudder under divine holiness. And they adjust their behavior, not in worship, but in fear of judgment. And that's what Edwards is talking about. It is possible then to say that I have this wonderful idea of who God is. I can understand the attributes of God, but it is not helping when it comes to helping someone who needs this. Is that a faith that is yours? Something that you know in your head, but doesn't really translate into this. And he says, the devils have all been to the greatest divinity school in the universe. They've been in the heaven of heavens. There's nothing wrong with that. And Edwards says, get all the knowledge you can, get all the accuracy you can, that's fine. But you have to realize that having that doesn't necessarily qualify you to be anything more than a demon. If all you have is just right theology, right philosophy, and even the right emotional response, but your life is not showing fruit, it says technically your faith is demonic faith, just like the faith of a demon. And he says there's nothing wrong with having conscience pangs. There's nothing wrong with actually realizing if there is a God who is the great creator, then I have to obey him. There's nothing wrong with that, Edwards says. And there's certainly nothing wrong with understanding doctrine and understanding about God and the attributes of God and the nature of God and the unity of God, like it's mentioned here. There's nothing wrong with that. But he says that doesn't prove you have any faith at all. Your faith is not living, it's not real, and it's not saving. A person with saving faith will have all these things, but a person who has these things does not necessarily have saving faith. So by one negative example, we see what are insufficient signs. And third, and this is kind of descriptive before we move to the next point of most of our people inside and outside the church. This is talking about religious people. The first is irreligious people. This is religious people, where They believe in God, but their life doesn't show any love or fruit towards others. There are people from many other religions who may also do good works. That's what James was talking. Show me your works, and I'll show you my faith. What he's saying is, well, it's not that nobody does good works. The question is, why do you do good works? Why do you try to help someone? Well, I was talking to a friend recently, and he was sharing how his wife was in a very high executive position, making a 7-figure salary, traveling in first class all around the world, doing incredible work. And he himself is a very successful businessman, doesn't really need any money. He said, as we were getting older, I realized began to get concerned about my wife's health. If she's doing this, and I realized if something happens to her, and if she dies, who will take care of me? So I told her to stop working and do something she really loves. And so she quit her 7-digit salary, and now she is doing this cool startup for a nonprofit to help vulnerable children. Well, that's good works. But the motive for that good works was so that his wife will not die because of this high-pressure job, so he will have her so she can take care of him. There's always, even if for those who are doing those works, the question is always about, what's your motive? What's your motive? And sometimes that's what other philosophies say. Well, I know I'm not a perfect guy. I make some mistakes, not terrible, but a little bit here and there. But I do a lot of good. And my hope is just before I die, that I just accumulate enough good things in my life so that it takes care of the bad things. And I'll somehow make it to whatever is waiting on the other side. That's a faith, he says, is demonic faith. And lastly, he closes with, what is living faith? How do you unleash a dynamic faith, which is no talk, all walk? Well, not necessarily no talk, because God technically calls us to even share about our faith, but our walk is louder than our talk, or matches our talk. He does that by giving 2 examples from the Bible. And let's read that. He says, was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see, that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. He uses the phrase faith apart from works is dead 3 times. That's a central theme. So he's giving 2 examples here to tell us what dynamic faith looks like. The 2 examples are 2 extremes of the spectrum. One is a patriarch, another is a prostitute. A patriarch is an iconic hero, a symbol of faith. It's called the father of faith. Everybody knows who Abraham is. And Rahab is on the outermost spectrum of society, someone who everybody looks down at as a prostitute. But he says these 2 people actually displayed dynamic faith. And that's huge, isn't it? What is that? What was so dynamic about their faith? What happened to Abraham? Abraham was not instantaneously a man of faith. He didn't have much faith, other than he just came when God told him to go. But then he was wrestling with believing God. He had a lot of doubts about God. He was working through that, and that's totally fine. James himself was someone who never believed his own brother Jesus was God. But what happens as he matures, he has this encounter with God and sees God's grace in his life, where God shows up to him. And he gets to have this one-on-one encounter, and after that he says, We read in the New Testament, Jesus says, before Abraham was I am, your father Abraham saw me. So Abraham had this futuristic vision of who Jesus was, and that changed him. That changed him because now his object of love shifted tremendously. That's huge. How did that shift really happen? He says God calls Abraham, who has no children, gets one son at the age of close to 100, and God tells him, go sacrifice your son. That's huge. What God is basically telling Abraham is, He just not is asking him to give some money or some time. He's telling him to sacrifice his posterity. He's asking him to sacrifice that which he is putting his faith on. Children are very precious to us, isn't it? As parents, and especially as Asian parents, we'll give an arm and a leg to make sure our children succeed. But what happens if God tells you to do something like this? When God said sacrifice your son, there is no law anywhere that says you have to sacrifice your son. It's not there in the Bible. But why did God do that? Is he being like a very cannibalistic, tribal, religious God who says, I want you to sacrifice your son? No, but when Abraham lifted the dagger, God tells him, stop, you don't have to slay him. He doesn't, what does he say? He says, do not slay the lad. Why? For I know now you love me, because you did not withhold your son, your only son, whom you love, from me. The reason we are not able to walk the talk is because we love anything and everything other than God, which is where our heart really is. And so we are not to let go of the things we love, like money or time or ourselves. God was after his heart, his love. And Abraham responded in love. There was no law there. There's no rule. That's not one of the 10 commandments. God was saying, I want you to do this because of who I am. I want you to love me first. That's dynamic faith. That's living faith. It responds to that. Is your life all your religiosity, just a lot of shuddering, or is it a transformed desire for friendship? Because God was looking for friendship with man. Isn't it amazing? You will not read about that in any other philosophical worldviews or religions where it says God is looking and condescending to be a friend for you and me, and he's wanting that friendship. After Peter disowns Jesus, a disciple of Jesus, 3 times, Jesus goes after Peter. What is the question that Jesus asks Peter? Does he ask Peter, are you ready to go do ministry for me? Does he ask Peter, hey, how much are you going to give away? 3 times. The only question Jesus asks is, Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? There are a lot of exegetical commentaries on that. There are different words in the Greek for love. It's agape. Sometimes commentaries say that it reflects a very deep, unconditional love. But there is a love. C.S. Lewis wrote a beautiful book called 4 Loves. He talks about 4 different Greek words that talk about 4 different kinds of love. Eros, storge, philos, and agape. Eros is erotic love. Storge is affection, something like you have for your dog. Phileo or Philadelphia comes from that friendly love. And agape is unconditional love. Jesus asks Peter, Peter, do you phileo me? Are you my friend? And Jesus is looking for that relationship. When God becomes our friend, if you have a friend, you'll do anything. I don't know if you all remember your teenage years, when one of the biggest things for you, and if you have teenage children now, you will know, is the most important thing in their life is friends. And sometimes they want to go out with friends. And you can ask them, where do you want to go? Well, they say, I don't know. You can ask them, what do you want to do? They say, I don't know. Just So then why are you dressed up so nicely if you're just going out with friends to do what? I don't know. They actually don't know, because you know what they really want? Hang out with friends. What they do doesn't matter. You remember that we also are like that, isn't it? Don't look at your children judging them like that when they do it. You did it too. Be truthful. That's what God's asking. Hey, am I your friend? Are you my friend? Do we have that love dynamic? And if I am your primary and full and whole consuming love, you will not mind giving away everything for the sake of it when you see a need. That's living faith. You know why? God demonstrated that for us. Abraham walked with Isaac up on a mountain. God tells him to kill his son to test his love and stops him. But God the Father walked up a mountain with his son and sacrificed his son himself on the cross. He didn't stop. He went through with it. A Christian looks at God sacrificing his son and says, now I know you love me, for you did not withhold your son, your only son, whom you love from me. Does that give us goosebumps? Does that unleash a living faith in you and me? Does your heart go out to that kind of a love? It says, I don't care what he does for me. All that matters is that I please and know and rest in the bosom of one who did this for me. I want his friendship. That's living faith. That's faith unleashed, my dear friends. When you have that faith, you will be willing to let it go, lose everything, like Paul says, to gain Christ. And Jesus says in Matthew, that's the mark of true faith. He said, when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was in prison, you came to see me. Jesus himself says, if you love God, you will show your love in being there for people like that. You know, in some of our homes in this country, you have this carbon monoxide detector, right? And when you buy a home or when you sell a home, they would ask you to test if that detector works. And that detector has, I think, a button. If the battery is still there and the sensor works, which is like when some carbon monoxide comes, and it's dangerous because you can't smell it and people die. I had a pastor friend, his son died. Carbon monoxide coming from smoke from a fireplace. So it's very important to make sure the carbon monoxide works, because when a fire breaks out, there's fire, there's smoke, there's heat, but with this carbon monoxide, you don't have anything. So the way you test that, if the battery is up, do you guys know how it is? You press and hold that button, and it gives a particular type of sound. If it does, then you know there's battery in it, and the sensor is working. So I'm going to ask you today, why don't you press your faith button and see what comes out? Is it a living faith? Is it a dead faith? Or it is a demonic faith? If it is a living faith, then God wants us not to have abstract compassion. It can mean something simple like moving towards a person who is sitting alone or exhausted or anxious or struggling, giving them your time. Bay Area, you hear this a lot. Time is money. It's easy for people to give money. I'll just write you a check. Just don't bother me. Give me my time. And as families, your children will learn by watching how you respond to others in need. If you close your eye and walk away, that's something you will expect for them. And as a church, are you sensitive to those who are hurting, grieving, lacking basic support? A living faith notices and moves towards that, because our God saw us. And we know that we can do this because we all know we were naked, spiritually bankrupt. We had nothing to cover ourselves, and we were ashamed. And Jesus covered us with this righteousness. And that's the righteousness that saves, that will produce fruit. You know, we have an apple tree in our backyard. We just planted it 3-4 years ago. It's a very tiny one. I'd never seen a lot of apple trees. None of us did when we were growing up. In my mind, I was thinking, an apple tree will produce fruit when it becomes like a big tree. But this thing was just when it was 7 or 8 feet tall, started producing tons of apples. A lot of apples, way more than we can collect and even distribute. And whether you like it or not, every year they just grow, they fall, and sometimes when we go for a walk, we crush and you can smell the apple. Because that's what an apple tree does. It produces fruit, whether it likes it or not. That's what a living faith does. It produces fruit that is beneficial.